Hi.
Hi. Okay.
You guys, how's my sound?
You sound good.
Good.
Okay.
What about me? Am I okay?
Yeah, a little glitchy.
Okay.
Maybe when you present, you turn off your video.
Okay.
I hear background noise from somebody.
Shirley, if you could mute yourself, that would be great.
Hi.
Hi.
I can't
Carter,
hear
can
anybody.
you? Oh, I'm a co-host now. Awesome.
Can you hear anybody?
Yeah. Can you hear us, Patricia? Patricia?
Hello.
Patricia, can you hear us?
you.
We can hear
I
you.
can't hear anybody.
So I'm going to turn off my video when I
I'm the
present,
co-host now.
correct?
Yes. Why don't you turn it off now? Let me just test it. Oh, my Jameson's teacher is on. Oh, Shanna is promote to panelist.
Hello.
Can you hear us,
I can't hear
Patricia?
anybody.
Yeah.
Shanna.
Yeah. Mark, can you text Trisha?
Yeah.
Patricia? Sorry. Okay. Hi,
Should I go
Shanna.
in and come
Can
out
you hear
again?
us? Shanna, can you hear us?
I see people talking, but I
I'm
don't
gonna get
hear
some water and I'll
anybody.
be right back.
Okay, perfect. We're realistically going to start it.
I can't hear anybody.
Patricia, why don't you log out and
Oh.
come back in?
Yeah?
We can hear you. Fine. You just can't hear us. I don't know why.
All right, I'm going to leave and come back.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Okay.
She's going to try to log back in. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you. Sorry, I just got dinner. I don't know. I'm going to have to scarf it down in 4 minutes. So excuse me.
I have my dinner all prepared on baking sheets to just pop it in the oven.
So in a few minutes, probably in like 6:35, we'll be recording, but we'll let everybody know when that
Do you know
starts.
what's going on?
We can hear you.
Did you give Carter
I
the
can't hear
Q&A
anybody.
instructions?
No, let's adjust those because we're hosts.
Yeah, I can't hear anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see what we are.
I still can't hear anyone. Oh, God. What is up with my computer?
You still can't hear us?
Hello? Can you
Are you using headphones?
No.
I can hear you.
Did you remember to join with computer audio?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you fine. We can hear you. You just can't hear us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, it works. Okay, thank you.
There we go. You can hear us now?
Yeah, is Carter on the call? Because Dr. Smith wants a link to join.
I'll take
Carter is on the call.
The link is on the website. It's this, if she registers, then we can elevate her.
Oh, all right then.
Okay. You guys.
I'm not sure if I registered, but I'm here. So
All right, then let me.
I registered you because I knew you had an earlier meeting.
I'm so thankful for
yeah.
that. You're not techie.
Yeah, I was like, just maybe I should.
Were you able to do that with the chat?
I don't know. Can we just, you guys, can we take this logistics stuff offline because we have 14 attendees?
Okay.
15 and counting people are coming in.
Oh, how do I get her?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, who's that?
Hi, this is Marisol.
Hi, Marisol.
Hi, can you see me?
Let me see.
I
I don't see her.
don't see her.
Do we need to elevate her to panelist? Because, let me see.
I'm gonna raise my hand, see if you can find
Yeah,
me.
raise your hand, please. Okay.
She's under the name William Mark.
That's her?
Yeah, William Mark, I believe is Marisol. I don't know.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're registered under the name William Mark.
Yeah, that's my assistant, so he
Okay.
probably did it for me. I see you now. Hi.
Okay,
Can you see me?
perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good.
Okay. Oh, Dr. Shirley's there. Good.
Everyone will be beginning in just a minute. We are going to be live streaming this on Facebook because a number of people were not able to join us tonight and wanted to watch this. And we're just waiting for that to load. And as soon as it's loaded, we will begin. Good evening. My name is Janine Kiley, and I am the chair of Community Board 2 Schools and Education Committee. And I wanted to welcome you this evening for our discussion about how to talk to kids about racism. We have a great lineup of speakers tonight, but I first wanted to hand it over to Carter Booth, the chair of Community Board 2, who wants to make a short announcement. Carter.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I wanted to announce, I announced this last night at our executive meeting that Community Board 2 is starting a new working group, the Equity Working Group, which is going to be co-chaired by Mar Fitzgerald, who's on with us, and Patricia Laria, who's on with us as well tonight. And this is obviously in result of all the events in the last 3 weeks, and also actually over most of our lifetimes. We're going to start looking at some of the policies and procedures of Community Board 2 itself, as well as looking out at issues within our community and within the areas that fall under our purview. Our first meeting is on Tuesday, June 30th. That's a little over a week from now. And I'm looking forward to any of you who are interested in attending to join us. With that, Janine, you want to?
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Good evening. So I wanted to, before I introduce our speakers, I just want to take everyone through our meeting protocol. We are asking that everyone be respectful to whoever is speaking. If you have a different view and you want to ask a question, when we get to the questions at the end, raise your hand or type a question in the question box at the bottom of the screen. All the attendees will be on mute until Q&A. And we will, during the meeting, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And if we're not able to answer a question today, we'll be getting back to you because I think everyone is registered for this meeting. In terms of Q&A norms, please use I versus you statements. Be brief and concise with your question, not a statement. And all questions on the topic tonight, which is how to talk to your kids about racism, will be heard and considered subject to time. And please honor the diversity and acknowledge the varied experiences, needs, and values of this group that we've formed tonight. Where this is, given the limitations of Zoom, this is not going to be a fully interactive discussion. But at future points, we'd love to have more interactive discussions where we would have, we would be following these norms for facilitating courageous conversations. At this point, I just want to introduce our committee members. We have the vice chair of our committee, Patricia Laria. Let me just ask you to raise your hand. Mar Fitzgerald, who Patricia and Mar were integral to putting this event together. Akila Azqui, who is a member of our committee and a presenter tonight. Betty Kabovi-Weiss, a high school student who is now a member of Community Board 2. Matt Metzger, Barbara Glassman, a retired middle school principal. Amy Brenna, right here. Keen Berger, she's a psychologist, a parent, grandparent, and a former chair of School Board 2 when it was a school board. Rich Cacapolo, and we have our district manager, Bob Gormley. We also have Shirley Smith, who used to chair this committee, Dr. Shirley Smith. We have several other community board members on this call as well. So I want to introduce tonight's speakers. We have Marisol Rosales. She is the Manhattan Executive Superintendent for the Department of Education. She's a 27-year veteran of the DOE. Prior to this role, she was the superintendent for Manhattan High Schools, and she currently supervises 7 districts in Manhattan through the citywide office. And she likes to build high-performing teams, is passionate about children and creating equitable opportunities. And the tidbit, she's going to be a grandmother in 2 months. Our second speaker will be Akila Azqui. Akila holds a PhD in clinical psychology and works with children. She's also the parent of 3 children living in District 2 and the co-PTA president of her children's elementary school. Akila is, as I mentioned, is a member of Community Board 2 and graciously agreed to present tonight about talking to our children about racism. We have Shanna Douglas. She's the principal at Lower Manhattan Community School, a downtown middle school. She spent the last 17 years teaching ELA in middle school. 5 of those as an 8th grade teacher at LMC. She strongly believes that schools should be a place where academic, social, and emotional learning takes place. And because of this, there's no other place she would rather be than at LMC. She's a Brooklynite, so outside of school, you might see her at Greenlight Bookstore when it reopens or at curbside pickup. Or spending quality time with her family. And I just want to throw out her favorite middle school novel is To Kill a Mockingbird. And we also have with us from the DOE, Wanda Luz Vasquez. She's the Senior Director of Race and Equity at the Office of Equity and Access. Formerly to that, she served as a new principal support coach in the Office of Leadership and as principal of El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice. She is committed to systems level leadership aimed at interrupting and dismantling systems of inequity, impacting the young people and families that the DOE serves. And she'll be here to answer any questions we may have at the end. So at this point, I'm gonna ask that all of our CB2 members who aren't presenting or running the chat, turn your video off. And I'm gonna turn it over to Akila Azqui, who will begin our presentation. Thank you. Akila?
Hi, thank you. Okay, so let's get into it. This presentation is really geared towards parents and really addresses the topic of this discussion, how to talk to your kids about racism. During this presentation, I'm going to discuss 5 words that will help all of us understand why beginning this dialogue with our children is so important. The first terms I want us to hold on to are race and racism. Race is the social construct that classifies people by skin color. There is no genetic or scientific basis for this classification. Racism refers to a system of power and oppression based on race, to which there are 4 levels: individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Children can identify these levels of racism at different developmental stages. My 10-year-old son had to write a response to his teacher's question. She asked, "It's been over 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education ruled that separate but equal is unjust and schools must integrate. Have they? What is your personal opinion?" He responded that he thinks in his life, schools are not integrated because the majority of the students are white at the school he attends, being about 42%. The school shares a building with another school that is 85% Black and Hispanic. Right in that moment of his response to a school assignment, I can see that my child can classify people based on race and begin to identify evidence in his world of structural racism. My child's response is not surprising. We know that children as young as 3 years old show awareness of race and begin to categorize people by race. Research also shows that children on the receiving end of racial prejudice, children of color, will develop racial awareness even earlier due to their experiences. By 6, children will begin to demonstrate prejudicial behaviors. Those are the famous studies that show how children will assign negative characteristics to Black children and more positive characteristics to white children. So we know that our children see skin color and form judgments based on race. Now you might say to yourself, after looking at the news and seeing the brutality and violence around us that people of color experience, that this is too much for children. The response to that is that our children live in a world where racially biased associations exist. Children don't need bigoted parents to develop racial bias. Research has shown that simply not talking about racism to your children will allow racial bias and stereotypes to become internalized. Bias comes to them through books and movies where princesses are mostly white, through advertising that is all around them. It comes to them through being in schools where teachers and students are mostly from a single racial group. When children of color and white children only see white teachers, this reinforces a strong implicit bias associating teaching and higher education with being white. So, where do you begin to deal with this or respond to it? I just mentioned implicit bias. What is that really? Implicit bias is defined as having attitudes and stereotypes that impact how we think, our actions, and the decisions we make without our awareness or intentional control. In a study published last year, Black students were more likely to get negative feedback from their teachers, regardless of their behavior, as compared to white students. We will hear more about how implicit bias was identified and addressed in one of our downtown schools by Shanna Douglas. The first step in having a dialogue with our kids is to begin by confronting our own biases. And this slide here that just came up is demonstrating implicit bias through DOE data, where Black and Latinx New York City students in grades K through 8 were suspended at twice or 4 times the rate of white and Asian students last year in 2019. And other parts of DOE data shows us where implicit bias is existing. So the first step in this dialogue, this is the part where we need to begin by educating ourselves and asking ourselves crucial questions. What have I been taught about race? What are the views of race in my home, in my family, in my community, and in my child's school? What do I understand about race and ethnicity in my society? To answer these questions for oneself, it's time to turn to books and documentary and really dive into learning about systemic racism and how it impacts our lives. This is where we can begin respectful conversations with other adults and ask questions that we might have avoided in the past. Doing this part is setting the example for our children. So once we understand implicit bias and how kids already see skin color at very young ages, we can understand that being colorblind, or saying that you don't see color, only supports systemic racism. Being colorblind in research has been linked to a greater frequency of committing microaggressions. Microaggression. And I really love this slide. Microaggression is understood as an act that invalidates or harms a person of color, and one that the perpetrator is mostly unaware of having committed. It is an extension of one's implicit bias. These are some examples of microaggression. You can see in this slide, there are different young people of different cultural backgrounds holding up statements that have been said to them. And these are examples of microaggressions. When entering these discussions with our children, it is important to make sure that discussions are developmentally appropriate so that our children will understand. For younger children, understanding what systemic racism means is difficult. However, children can indeed understand racism. A natural entry point is using the concept of fairness. Children, as we know, have a very strong sense of when things are unfair and fair. When one begins this dialogue about racism, there are many helpful openings with your child. You can use books, movies, current events, news stories, and maybe even experiences that someone has shared with you. These experiences can be used to highlight for your child how something hurtful and harmful happened to a person who has a darker skin color, and how that type of unfairness is what is called racism. For younger children, it is important to be authentic and intentional in how we speak to them. For example, cultivating a diverse library, not only in our homes, but in our schools, with narratives that don't only portray marginalized groups as suffering or in crisis, or marginalized groups as being saved by outsiders. It is also important to avoid reading only hero narratives about exceptional individuals. Seek out stories of multidimensional characters living complex lives. Through our curious questioning, we teach our children to become critical readers and thinkers, asking them questions like, are there certain groups who never become the princess or the hero? Who gets to be considered pretty? With current events, it is recommended to tell children the truth, give them age-appropriate details, and let them lead the conversation. Ask them what they want to know about the story. We want to ask questions to find out what they are thinking and how their ideas developed. Ultimately, this ongoing dialogue we have with our children is meant to communicate that even though there is racism, there have always been people working to change it, and we can be part of it too. Now it is the time to be that advocate. An advocate, what has been termed as anti-racist. An anti-racist is someone who takes concrete action to undo systemic racism. This involves teaching your children about racism and realizing that our kids learn more from our behaviors than our words alone. We can take actions to overcome our own implicit bias. For example, diversifying friend groups, speaking up when you hear a microaggression. We can all realize the damage we do if we act as if we are neutral, not acknowledging that no one is neutral when witnessing someone being disrespectful or explicitly biased. I recently read a letter written by students at the Bronx Science High School, in which they identified many instances of performative activism within their school leadership, which is when a person does subliminal levels of activism that are really insufficient in affecting any change. They gave many examples of how the school leadership used performative activism tactics to thwart real change, such as failing to have Black and Latinx teachers represented on staff for more than 15 years, or how the student-led effort to create a racial equity board faced more obstacles than the other boards, and administration committed time to discussing the name of the board rather than how the board could actively confront racial issues. This further supports the research that children and youth can easily discern authentic actions from empty words and promises. Saying to our children that we are not racist is distinctly different from showing them by taking actions in our communities and in our schools to undo systemic racism. Children really know the difference. Thank you for listening, and hope our families start taking actions in our community to end systemic racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Akila. That was great. I'm realizing that I didn't, before we go into, I should have turned it over to Marisol Rosales, who is just gonna say a few words, and then we'll go to Shanna Douglas. Marisol, can I turn it over to you?
Absolutely. Can you
Okay.
hear me? Can everybody
Yes.
hear me? Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Good evening, everybody. I hope you're well and safe. My name is Marisol Rosales. I am the Executive Superintendent responsible and privileged to serve 116,000 children across Manhattan. I oversee 7 districts and 230 schools. I am also a brown woman, a mother of 2. I have a white daughter and a brown son. I'm a Latina, and I'm an immigrant. I was born in Chile. I'm the daughter of a beautiful white woman from Spain, may she rest in peace, who believed in the structures of social class. I am also the daughter of a brown father who believes in social justice and that education saves lives. I grew up in Chile. I went to an English school, a French school, and I went to a school that was led by nuns from Ecuador. My dad had to have it his way. So I grew up in a home with different perspectives. And my early experience with race, as I recall it, was mostly when I visited my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. I recall vividly the times that she said to me that I needed to marry a white man to improve the race. I remember vividly that during the month of October, my mom would celebrate her heritage and Christopher Columbus, and my dad would say to me that he was a rapist and that he was a thief. I moved to New York when I was about 17, and that's when I began to internalize racism. People made some assumptions about my capabilities because of my social construct, color of my skin, the way I spoke back then with a very thick accent. In college, I learned to sit at the back of a classroom, not because I didn't have the answers, I just didn't want to be called. I didn't want my peers to hear my accent. I married a white man, not because I was following the orders of my grandmother, but because I fell in love with a white man. I gave birth to a beautiful white daughter and a handsome brown son. And so over the years, I've lived 2 different experiences with my 2 children. Same home, same values, same parents, but very different experiences. And I'm saying this because the work of educating children for me is personal and it's professional. I believe in embracing multiple perspectives, the beauty of different cultures, identities, languages. And I also see how implicit bias, microaggressions, institutionalized racism impact our children. All children are beautiful and deserve the same quality education and be taught in an inclusive, integrated setting. I also want to say that we are at a tipping point of a long history of unjustified violence against our African American brothers and sisters. We need to come together and acknowledge that our Black and brown community is hurting and tired of systemic and institutionalized racism. As a brown woman, the head of this borough, I am so saddened by the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and most recently, Rayshard Brooks. My heart, my prayers are with their family and our African American community across the country, the city, and our community right here. I was at a town hall meeting this morning in District 5, and the beautiful voices of our young people were present in the space. They were so powerful. They spoke about being sad and afraid to go to the corner store and afraid of the police. Our beautiful children are traumatized. Their parents have been traumatized for decades, and they're tired, they're frustrated, and they're angry. So trauma-informed pedagogy is real and a new way of teaching our educators in Manhattan. We will be training our teachers, our principals, our district staff throughout the entire summer on trauma-informed pedagogy. There's no place for racism in any racist act within our school communities. And while we need structural changes to dismantle systemic and institutionalized racism, we can do a lot within our sphere of control. And so when we speak about taking action, our superintendents across Manhattan and I wrote a collective letter to our 230 principals, asking them to take action against institutionalized racism and reminded them of the tools we have learned together to engage in conversations about race. I am so happy that Wanda is here today, who represents that office, who's been tasked with training all of DOE. And I am really encouraged by the conversation that are beginning to take place across our community and at home. Children, as we learned, can internalize racial bias as early as 2 and 3 years old. So this is a moment for us to take action, to teach our children about race and racism and implicit bias. And we can do it in a loving way. We can do it by teaching empathy, history, science, civic action, social justice, and humanity. And so as we begin to reimagine our education system, I need all of us to remain grounded in our children, our values, and disrupting these systemic racism and inequitable practices so that when we return to our buildings, we are a better world for our children. I am so happy to be here tonight. I am so happy to answer and offer my perspective and to be in the presence of these panelists and in your presence. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Marisol. We really appreciate it. I'm going to share a screen again. Just a moment, please. I'm going to turn it over to Shanna Douglas, who can talk about how you put this in action and what Lower Manhattan Community School has done under her leadership and during her time there. Shanna, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Janine. It's great to be here with everyone and to give me the opportunity to share LMC story. I would like to say that while this work was going on, I was a classroom teacher and a grade level facilitator with the 8th grade team. And my principal at that time was Kelly McGuire, who is now the deputy superintendent in District 15 in Brooklyn. And Ben Jabal, who is the principal of 131, was my assistant principal then. So I'm going to say that this work is really like, this is not just me. It was basically, it was an entire school community of teachers and of leaders who came together to ensure that, that we were going in the right direction when we talked about, dismantling systems of inequity in our schools. So the first slide is our mission statement. And this mission statement was created in 2016. And it was in response to what we saw were implicit biases, microaggressions, and institutionalized racism that was taking part in our school after specifically looking at data, looking at demerits, looking at suspensions, looking at how teacher and student interactions, as well as student and student interactions. You can go to the next slide. And I say that because I want you to know that what I'm going to share with you today didn't just happen in one day, right? So you're going to see these years. It happened over a period of time, and it became something that was embedded in the fabric of our community. We talked about race. In the hallways when teachers met, we talked about race. We call each other out, and it became a normal thing to do in our environment. And I think that's what made us. That's what has allowed us to be where we are at this particular moment. So in 2013, LMC decided to take on restorative justice practices, something that we all hear about quite often right now. And we decided to become an RJ school because we wanted to have an alternative to a zero tolerance policies, We wanted to prevent the school push out and school to prison pipeline. We wanted to address behavioral disruptions in a non-punitive way, but most importantly, we wanted to really strengthen our school community and social emotional learning, right? We are a 6 through 8 school. Telling students that, you know, you're doing this wrong and labeling them as bad is not the way we want to go about things. That's not how kids learn. So our basic, when we wanted to implement restorative justice, we really wanted to focus on building a sense of community and talking to children about learning from their mistakes, restoring the harm done to the community. However, this is not just about children. It also means that everyone needs to be involved. It means that teachers as well as administrators needed to be reflective of their practices. And what led us to implementing restorative justice, Janine, next slide.
Oh, okay.
Is that we realized that in 2013, which is where it's maybe around a little bit less than 600, we realized that over 80% of our Black and brown kids were being assigned or received demerits from their teachers. We are currently a school where right now we have about 23% Black and Latinx students. It was around the same percentage, maybe a little bit less by then, but you could only imagine that. Here was a school where there were not that many Black and brown kids, but the number of demerits given to this group is really, really high. And Kelly McGuire at that time asked us this question: why is this happening? Why are we assigning so many demerits to our Black and brown kids? It was a difficult question for us to answer. We also realized that in our work around restorative justice, that whenever we would have fairness circles, which is how we handle issues that came up in our schools, where students will gather around in a circle and talk out their problems, we realized that many of these circles, there were certain race issues that came up. So things were said that were offensive by our students, and sometimes they were aware and sometimes they were not aware of the impact of their words. So we realized that we really had to focus heavily on race for our kids and for ourselves. Next. So this led us to doing some work with our staff. Ooh.
Not the right slide?
Not the right slide.
Okay, is it this one? No. Did we lose the slide? Oh no. Well, I'm gonna just let you talk. It looks like we're missing some.
So when working with our staff, the first thing that we did was to go ask for help. Hello, we wanna talk about this, this is an issue in our school. What do we do now? And Border Crosses got involved. Border Crosses is now called, I think it's the Center for Racial Justice in Education. And they held workshops for us. And we had some difficult conversations with Border Crossers. We talked about race as a social construct. We talked about racism. We talked about white privilege. For me as a teacher then, these were really, thank you, these were really difficult conversations to have. There were times when I went to Kelly McGuire and I said, I don't want to talk about this anymore. This makes me feel very uncomfortable. And he would say to me, we have to push on. We need to do this work. And we stayed with this work for that year. And at the end of that year, we decided that we wanted to go ahead and work in affinity groups. And we created 3 different teacher affinity groups to discuss race, because before we can implement it with the kids, the work needed to be done amongst ourselves. And if we had a white affinity group, we had a Black and Latinx affinity group among our teachers, and we also had an Asian affinity group. And we will come together to discuss issues that our community faced and things that we needed to do in order to resolve the problems. We also conducted additional workshops. We had book clubs. I think our very first year, we read the books by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So we were all really we dived into this subject, even though it was difficult. If you ask why did we decide to do affinity groups, we decided because, you know, there are some shared experiences between people who are similar. Even with the knowledge that even when you have these shared experiences, there might be differences, right? because my story as an African-American woman might be totally different from somebody else's story as an African-American woman. The same thing for Asians and the same thing for whites. We also wanted these groups to process trauma together. When we discuss these issues in groups, as Marisol just talked about her experiences growing up, I got a lot of flashbacks to my years in high school and in college, where Marisol, I didn't sit in the back, I actually sat in the front because I didn't want to be the only person of color in that classroom. So these discussions brought up a lot of trauma that I had carried, that I thought I had resolved, and I needed to discuss them with a group of people that had a similar experience or that understood my experience. This did not mean that we did not come together as an entire community and talked about things, but there were definitely times when we decided that we needed to talk about these issues in affinity groups. So at the end of that 2015-2016 year, our race mission statement was created. We didn't stop there. We continued looking at data. We looked at the demerits and see if they dropped. And if you can recall the slide from previously, you notice that there was a drop in the demerits. The X marked the 2015 when we started to have the affinity group discussion. We looked at our suspension rates. We looked at special education evaluation requests, right? Were we asking for our Black and brown students to be evaluated because we were, we thought indifferent of them? Did our implicit bias play a role in that? We ask our students questions, and if you know middle schoolers, you know they can be very honest with you. And we would ask them questions about teacher interactions. We will ask them questions about our policies and our procedures. We looked at state math and ELA test scores, our Black and brown kids, and some schools, we do our measures of student learning, our MOSLs as they call it, a form of city assessment. And we looked at how our Black and brown kids were doing, and we ask ourselves, what are the instructional steps that we need to take in order to address the issues that we saw? So we had changes in our policy that came out of this, but we also had our changes in our instruction that came out of this. Next, please. So where did the shifts take place? So here we started in 2013 or 2012 looking at this data, asking ourselves, are we unfairly treating our Black and brown kids in a biased way? Then we went ahead and we did our affinity circles. And then where else are we seeing these changes in how LMC operates as a school? Well, all our staff and students can refer an incident to a fairness circle. So instead of you saying, I'm giving this kid a demerit, instead of you're going to that final punishment, this kid needs to be suspended, we decided that before we get to that point, we need to go back to our core values of beliefs in restorative justice and have those fairness circles. Students can also request fairness circles with teachers. So this is not just between a student and a student, this can also be a student and a teacher. We decided to create in our advisory curriculum to have lessons focused on identity, race, and racism. And we dealt with, in these lessons, we talked about prejudice, we talked about discrimination, we talked about privilege, we talked about structural, interpersonal, internalized racism. We wanted those things to be part of the vocabulary that our kids were having. I also want to mention that the staff continued their affinity staff circles too throughout all of this. So we never just said we're going to do it for a time. We continued these kind of systems and practices because we knew that, you can't, this issue is not going to go away now. It's not going to go away with one breath or with one policy. It is where the mind has to be consistently worked upon. You have to be consistently reflecting on what you're doing and what you're saying and how you're acting. And then there were these instructional shifts that took place, changes in our curriculum. Now, it's not just about the text. We hear a lot that people, well, you add a couple of books of color and where they're authors or characters of color, and that's it. We wanted to push and move beyond that. And it was not just about the text, but also about the discussions that you're having around those texts. I love To Kill a Mockingbird. There is a white savior complex in To Kill a Mockingbird. That is a rich conversation to have with your 8th grade class. We had school-wide goals where we isolated our Black and brown students. And I think this was the beauty, because no longer were we gonna be like, well, you know, that's just the data out there. We literally put a lens on our Black and brown kids in our school. We set goals around high expectations, providing leadership opportunities for Black and brown kids, and also around building relationships. We had inquiry work around dealing with our Black and brown kids, where we would look at teacher interactions in the classroom. So where staff will walk into other teachers' classrooms and we will check, how many times has this teacher interacted with students in their classrooms of color? What are they saying? Are these interactions about discipline? Are they about feedback? Are they instructional? What is the interaction between this teacher and this student in their room? And then how does this impact their students? 2 years ago, I was part of a small teacher group where we focused on our Black girls, our girls of color, Black and brown girls of color. And that was the most interesting and enriching conversations I think we've had. Because as I said, middle schools are very honest, and they're going to let you know how they think you perceive them in the classroom. Whether or not you meant so, they're going to be honest about that. And from the Black and brown girls that we spoke to, many of them thought that they weren't getting that individualized help from their teachers as other students were. Others didn't see that they were smart enough, right? Where they saw the Asian students, who represented about 44% in my school, they saw those kids being favored and in the spotlight, and they weren't getting that type of treatment. And once that was said to us, made so clear, it turned us around. So the inquiry work, creating instructional goals that addresses the inequity in the school, were ways that we really started to see our work taking root, right? We were no longer just talking about racial injustice, but we were walking. We were walking the talk, as they say. Next slide, please. So that led to the incident that took place in our country a few weeks ago with the death of George Floyd, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of remote learning. And I think that weekend I got a flood of emails from my students, my 7th graders and my 8th graders, some who wanted to do something right away, others who wanted a moment to talk, as well as for my teachers who wanted us to respond in a way. And I do want you to know that at this point, many of our 7th and 8th graders have that language around race, right? Because we've set the foundation of having restorative justice practices. They know that when an incident occurs where race is an issue, we can come and talk about it and we can resolve it together, because a harm has been committed to our community, and it's not just a harm that's been done to an Asian student or to a Black student, but it's done to us all, and we can learn from that experience. So I was not surprised when they reached out. And we decided that we were going to address this development in 2 ways. First, we were going to have homeroom discussions around the incident and allowing students an ability to answer and ask any questions that they had about the incident. We began the conversation by setting norms for courageous conversations, some that Janine actually mentioned at the very beginning of this recording. We talked about trauma and how trauma impacts, kids, but also for our Black and brown students, this was relived trauma, because now they're seeing these images on the screen over and over again. And for a lot of my Black and brown kids, they were afraid. And I think Marisol touched on that. They did not want to talk about this, right? They didn't mind listening, but they also didn't have the emotional space to deal with this. And so we held that session on a Friday, I think for about 45 minutes. And, you know, we ask our open-ended questions. And questions were about what have you seen or experienced in the past week? Any questions about what's happening? What do you think needs to happen? And how can we create change? We wanted these questions to be open-ended with the knowledge that we have kids who can go to their summer homes, but we also had kids who were in the middle of all of this, where the protests and the looting was happening outside of their windows. So we needed to be inclusive of the questions that we ask and give them time to process. And at the end of that session, we did post a survey where we invited kids for an extended conversation around race. And these kids can opt in, and these conversations occurred in affinity groups. Some groups were race. We had a group for only for Asian students. We had a group for Black and Latinx students focused on handling racism and how do you cope with it? How do you deal with this? We had a group around those who wanted to learn about the impact of racism on Asian Americans. We had a group for white students who wanted to be allied to Black people. Because a lot of my white students over the weekend was like, how can I help? What do I do? And we also had a group for biracial students because we knew that that was another complexity there. And the last group we had was to talk about, you know, like, why are these protests taking place? Because we had some students who did not understand, you know, the history of race in this country. And we wanted to unpack that with them. So these sessions happened. We really thought that they were going to be for 30 minutes, I would say, or maybe for 45. They went over an hour. My teachers had a meeting and they all showed up late. It's like, where were you guys? And they were having these discussions with their kids. We asked students to complete a survey at the end of that to talk about, you know, what did you, you know, how was this discussion? What else do you want to learn? And they asked for a second discussion. And on Monday, we had that second discussion with them. I read their comments, and some of them, you know, some students are still drained by this experience, and they don't know where else to go. A lot of my Asian students their interests have peaked about Asian history and the racism that Asians have faced in this country. And a lot of my students are like, oh, right, this is what I can do to be an ally. They've been given the tools that will inform them to do things later on. So in the end, I just want to say that, like, this discussion around George Floyd, around racism, didn't just happen at LMC. It's something that have been happening for a very long time. It happens with my 6th graders when they come in and there's an issue, and I can simply pull a 7th and 8th grade and I can say, can you please talk to the 6th grade and tell them why saying the N-word is just not appropriate? Tell them the story and they can talk to them about that. It happens in fairness circles where a student, when we're teaching about the KKK, a student says or does something inappropriate, and a small group of that class comes together and wants to talk to that student. And we truly do believe of not calling people out, but pulling people in. So when I talk about these things with parents are like, oh gosh, no, not my child. And we're like, no, that's not this is not what we're about. We're a community that we pull people in, we do not push them out. Because we know that this issue is so serious, and what we need to do is to consistently work on it. And that will not happen unless we start changing the minds of people, or unless we start actually encouraging and incorporating these courageous conversations, not just outside, not just here, but also in our classrooms and in our schools and with our teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanna. That was amazing. I'm going to turn it over to Patricia Laria, the vice chair of our committee, to talk about some resources, and then I'll go to Mar directly after that, and then we'll start Q&A. Patricia?
Thank you. We've compiled an anti-racist literary resource list here, and we will share this list of titles with you after the meeting. So when talking about race, oh, can you go back? Because I wanted to talk about the District 2 disproportionality. In February 2020 of this year, the CEC did a presentation on it. And what Shanna Douglas has mentioned, her school is the prime example of that District 2 data shows, like the Black and Latin and male students receive more IEPs, but that's my point I want to make. And you can go on to the next slide.
Okay.
Sorry.
And the next one, this one?
We've also have some reading books. A starter kit, we have an intermediate kit, as well as topics specific to like the color of law there, as well as becoming Michelle Obama. So we're gonna have all this available for you after the meetings. Thank you.
Mar Fitzgerald, also a member of our committee, and with Patricia will be leading the equity working group for Community Board 2. Mar?
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Yes, the Community Board 2 formed the equity working group as part of their commitment to making racial equity a primary focus. And here we have some examples of what you might do in your own school community to make it a primary focus. First, talk to your children. Akila gave us wonderful tools to be able to do that. Educate yourself, read books, watch films on the subject, and push yourself to have the difficult conversations. You know, it's uncomfortable, but it's supposed to be. Push for change at your child's school. I can't tell you how many parents have told us, you know, we just don't have these resources at our school. How do we get our community to be on board with this so that they can serve all of the children, you know, in their community? So specifically, you can support school-wide anti-racist initiatives, talk to your principal, talk to your teaching staff, make sure that the school is addressing these subjects to the students and to the parent community. You can join or initiate a diversity committee or an equity group, or form your own affinity group. Make sure the school has social justice policies, restorative justice policies, and that it is incorporated into the curriculum, right? Because we know Black history is not just slaves in the Civil War. And that's all. Also, support your borough and district-wide diversity councils to share resources and push for change. And we are going to share many, many resources and information for you guys. And that's all.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mar. I'm going to stop the screen share. So now we're going to open it up to Q&A. We received several questions in advance of the meeting. And then if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A or raise your hand, and Patricia will call on people, and we'll have some of our panelists, depending on what the question is, can answer the question. Patricia? You there?
You're muted.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this was a question received previously. Is diversity among teachers and students in the schools thought to be an effective approach towards ending racism? Who would like to take that question?
Akila, do you want to jump in a little? I know you talked about this a little bit.
Or Marisol?
Or Marisol?
Yeah,
Marisol,
sure.
I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you know, from a personal and professional. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. When I share my story with you, I share that I learned to embrace multiple perspectives from early on, right? I grew up in a home with a white mother and a brown father. And the beauty of it is that we begin to learn from one another's identity and culture in a beautiful, positive way, right? And I think part of the conversation tonight is how we talk about children, about race, and why we grapple with it is because we haven't talked about race for years. And so when we don't have a diverse setting, when we don't have children and staff from different backgrounds, different cultures, it's very difficult to talk about it, right? If we have just one race. And so diverse groups of teachers, diverse group of children create a rich, not just discussion, but a culture, right? And so we were talking about the books that we share, that we give our children, right? Where the protagonists are children of all different colors, right? Then children begin to see one another as equal, right? When we have teachers that are white and brown and black and Asian, then we begin to perceive teachers, right, as equal. And so that's the beauty of diversity, right? That we build from a place of strength, that we co-construct meaning of race by everybody in the room. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Yodit Walker, if you could raise your hand, she had a question.
We can read the question
Yeah.
too.
She asked, did you find her?
No.
All right, I'll read her question. It says, how do the white parents deal with this? Is it their responsibility?
It is their responsibility.
Who wants to take that?
Actually, Wanda, would you like to take that?
Or one, I just also I wasn't sure how to add to what Marisol was saying, so thank you, Superintendent Gonzalez. I also just wanted to say that diversity matters in the teaching force, it matters in the staff, because representation matters, right? And as children, who we see before us in the classroom, who we see before us in our school community, impacts who we are and who we believe ourselves to be, who we can become. And so I am Puerto Rican, and I did not have a Latino teacher my entire K-12 education in New York City. And that was detrimental to my development and to what I knew. And so learning about my history made a huge impact on who I am today. In terms of the question around whether white parents have to deal with this and if it's their responsibility, absolutely. At this point in time, it is a collective responsibility of all of us. It is a time where Black and brown people are dealing with traumatic events all at once, right? Coronavirus, COVID-19, this pandemic had a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities. The murder of George Floyd by state-sanctioned violence had an impact on Black and brown communities. Black and brown communities are traumatized and tired, right? And so at this point in time, I am calling in on white parents and white allies to move from ally to becoming co-conspirators to really lift this work, because we are, in many ways, as Black and brown folks who have been engaged in anti-racist work, exhausted and tired and needing to take a step back to heal and to process all that's happening. So yes, it is absolutely your responsibility. It is our collective responsibility. We cannot do this on our own.
Okay. Thank you, Wanda. Susan, would you like to ask your question live, or shall we read it for you? Raise your hand. Nope. Okay. Susan asks, I am a parent of 2 children. My eldest is a rising 4th grader in a school that is not racially diverse, nor is the staff diverse. We do not have a true program in place to help balance the education parents might be having at home with their children. When can we as parents see significant traction within our schools for policies and procedures that take into account the appropriate necessary instructions that will educate our student population?
You know, I could speak a little bit about that. just because we had such a beautiful example of what it is that we can do within our sphere of control at the very local, personal, and immediate. As I was listening to Shana talk about the amazing work that she's done with her school community. I think, and I said it earlier, we do need to dismantle some of the structures that continue to promote racism. And at the same time, I know that there is a lot I can do within what it is I can influence, right, at the borough level. And so the conversations that, and I also shared with you that last week, superintendents across Manhattan, all 7 of them, and I got together to write a collective letter, right? And so I know that the conversations that superintendents are having with their principals are about this work. I also know that we have many principals across Manhattan, such as Shannon, such as Kelly McGuire, and Kelly Shannon, who is here, who have been doing this work, right, for a while. And so there is part of this, and part of our work is this call to action. And while this is really challenging and difficult to do, right, it is challenging and difficult to do. It will require all of us to support one another. And tonight, this conversation is the beginning, right? We need to engage in the dialogue, and we also need tools to do that, right? Books is a beautiful thing, and it's not enough, right? The dialogue is what's going to be important, and the tools that we use to engage in that.
Thank you. Naomi, you can unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, good evening. I want to say a special thank you to CB2 for hosting this forum. I think it's really much needed, and I think it's what we need to start moving this conversation forward. I am not a resident of District 2, I'm a resident of District 3, but I thought this conversation was so impactful that I wanted to join. My name is Naomi Pena, I'm a resident of Lower East Side. And one of the things that I have personally been struggling with, and I identify as someone of person of color, I'm Latina, I have brown children who are also Latin, and one of the struggles I have been having lately is the amount of trauma that has been resurfacing for me. I've been super fortunate to be a part of Courageous Conversations, and I literally felt like I was in a therapy session, sort of like unloading. It was very great for me, but this has just resurfaced all that pain, all that suppressed sort of things that I don't want to talk about, that people thought I was white and would say some incredibly offensive things to me about other people, and how I often sit quiet. I find myself often helping my white allies who want to do something, giving them like a high five, virtual high five when they stand up to someone. But one thing that I've discovered as of late is even that is exhausting me. I'm tired of cajoling people. I'm tired of having people to understand my point of view. So my ask is, what should I be doing to ensure my mental stability? And, while I'm continuing to do the work that I'm doing within my own community, within my own circles, but also being not a resource. I want people to know that they can come to me if they have questions, but also not having it drain my own personal mental space and spirit, because I am dealing with my own trauma that no one's helping me with. So why should I be helping my white allies come to the other side and say, I'm sorry, Black and brown people are dying, let me help you? Thank you.
We have a question from Miss Fall, who's actually my daughter's science teacher. And
well,
she,
Mara,
yeah.
I wanted to answer.
Sorry.
What Naomi said.
And wait, before you answer, Naomi, thank you so much for coming. Naomi is also the president of the CEC in District 1, Education District 1, and has been doing amazing equity work. Amazing. Sorry, Akil, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I also, nice to have you on the call, Naomi. And I very much relate what you're talking about. In fact, you know, this is a conversation I just had yesterday with friends and colleagues about the draining, how draining it is for people like us who've been involved in this work for so long. And, you know, I've had so many countless experience of hearing these stories of trauma, having my own stories of trauma, and understanding that you have to put limits for yourself, and self-care is really an important part of this work. We can't do this work without taking care of ourselves. We can't be there for others without administering to our own needs. There are people that I call friends of mine when it gets overwhelming or too much. And actually, some of them are on this call right now, that I specifically call when I need to just, you know, get it out, vent, take care of myself. There are things I do. There are also a lot of resources, really amazing resources for people of color, parents of color, families of color. The American Psychological Association has a website called Resilience, which is geared towards families of color. They talk a lot about self-care and really addressing our own trauma. And it's something that we must do in order to engage in this work, because it is re-traumatizing for us to continually face the same terrorizing experiences over time. So, you know, self-care is a huge part of it. You know, therapy or whatever you find ways to reduce your anxiety, and to really take care of yourself so that you can continue all the amazing work that you do. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an answer. Thank you.
May I also add something to that? And Naomi, kudos to you and the work that you have done and continue to do in District 1, and what an amazing partner you've been to me as well. And I think 100% self-care is a priority, right? It's like we can't carry the burden, right? We need allies. And I also want to say that engaging in conversations about race with in homogeneous groupings as well as diverse groupings is a healing process. It really is. And so I would also encourage you to seek that group, right? I'm part of that group, right? And so it's actually a good reminder for me, Naomi, to bring our group together to just touch bases. So thank you for that, and hang in there. And it's okay not to be strong all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Do you want to, yeah. Do you want to read the next question?
The next question is for Shana, Ms. Douglas. It's from Salima El Amin. He said, these presentations are really great. And he said he would love for you to talk more about looking at special education evaluations, requests, and what was the result? What should we be wary of?
Well, so every year that we looked at this data, it was a little different, right? There were times that we realized that whenever like a student of color name would come up in a discussion with teachers about behavior, that there was actually something academic about it, right? So it was like, this child is struggling academically, but we label that academic issue as a behavioral problem. So that was like one thing that came up. We also realized that there were times that the teachers were actually, and this is not all teachers, but we did have, and this is why this data was so great, we did have like specific incidents where a teacher would request for an evaluation, but only of Black and brown boys. And these boys came in where their scores are really great. So they came in from elementary school doing really well, but within that classroom with that teacher was only saying, was recommending that these particular students be evaluated for special ed. And once we saw that, the next step that we did was like, well, let's go in and look. Let's see how this teacher's interacting with this student, right? And what we noticed was that most of the times it would be for behavioral, right? And this kid would either be in the back of the classroom, could do their work independently, but they would never be addressed about their academic, strengths. It was always about like, you need to turn around, you need to sit there, you need to do whatever. So that was not a positive interaction with the teacher in the classroom. So I would say that every year we look, and then that's why it's so important for us not to just look at this data once and say, okay, well, it says this and that's it, right? It's good to look at this data numerous times and actually see, what the trends or patterns are, not just for the kids of color, but also for the teachers, for staff, and and I was one of those teachers who also gave a lot of demerits out. My first couple of years at LMC. I'm not gonna sit here and say I didn't do that, right? There's internalized racism. I grew up in a system, where as somebody who's Black and brown, I was taught to speak a certain way or act a certain way. And when I see students who didn't speak that way or act that certain way, I would look down on it, right? So it was a great way for us to look at the trends and patterns of our Black and brown, but also the trends and patterns of our specific teachers, and speak to them about it. And also for you to be like, well, you know what, maybe this isn't the place for you.
I would, thank you for that. I would like to add a couple of things and actually invite Wanda to talk a little bit more. I think, this is a place where we can talk about the dominant culture and where we can talk about implicit bias, right? When we're all accustomed to a specific set of behaviors and standards, right? Because that is the dominant culture. And then we have children who don't align to that, don't follow that. There's an implicit bias that plays a role and begins to wonder about this child's capabilities, right? I also want to say something else. I was at a meeting yesterday and with a principal who shared with me that they were reconvening the special education team to evaluate a high school student because they felt this student needed more intense supports, right? This was prior to COVID. When they came back together, they took a look at the work that this young student had done during COVID, and it was all about what has taken place, about these violent acts and the murder of George Floyd and being an activist. And they could see through that work that this student, that there was no need for intense supports. What they needed to do with her was to make sure that the work that they were providing was relevant, was culturally relevant, that she was interested in this, right? And so I'm saying this because there is so much that we need to learn, and we just need to do better in terms of the materials and the books and the curricula that we are providing for our young students. I wanted to add that, and I wanted to pass it on to Wanda to see if she wanted to add anything else.
Sure, thank you. I will say that special education referrals across New York City are disproportionately impacting Black and brown boys in particular, right? And so when we ask, what are the things that we ought to be wary of, above all, or what are the belief systems that are giving permission for those disparities to exist, right? And so if we surface the fact that there are biases that we are all bringing with us into the classrooms and into our schools, we then have an opportunity to like mitigate and understand, how am I much more conscious of my bias, and where is it showing up in the curriculum, in the pedagogy, and what's happening in the classrooms? Because oftentimes it's that the curriculum is not responsive or relevant to the students in our classes. And it's a mix of the belief systems as well as the belief systems that lead to certain policies and processes to take place. And so in identifying the bias and really looking at the curriculum and what's coming up in a specific classroom or throughout a school, we begin to really disrupt and recreate policies that are rooted in the right belief systems that will assure equity for all, right? Or more equitable outcomes for students is what I'll add to that.
I also wanted to add to what everyone else is saying in terms of the historical context as well, building on what Wanda is saying about disproportionality going, special education referrals for Black and brown boys in particular. That is a long-standing disproportionality that really dates back to the 60s and has never changed and has actually only gotten worse and worse and worse over time. Black psychologists, a group of Black psychologists, very, a long time ago in the 60s or 70s, came out with data and showed that, things that we know of like achievement testing, intelligence testing that psychologists are using to classify children, disproportionately score lower, Black and brown boys disproportionately score lower on all of those kinds of testing, regardless of any other variable. So just being from either specific racial category, being Black or brown, being a male, being lower socioeconomic income will earn you a lower score on most of those measures. I mean, all of them that we have in our city as well. So this is a very long-standing, historically validated problem with the special education referral system. Also, it is much less likely for Black and brown boys to get out of special education categories once they are classified, whereas their white counterparts will mainstream. It is much less likely for Black or brown boys to get out once they are categorized. So it is a real area of concern.
Thank you, Akila. I have a question from Falguni Bhatt. He says, I'm not sure of the sex of the name. I'm sorry. How can we encourage more people from diverse backgrounds to join the teaching profession? Marisol? Or
I'm sorry, say that again.
How can we encourage more people from diverse backgrounds to join the teaching profession?
Yeah, that's a biggie. I think that it begins in high school, right? It begins in school, and it goes back to the conversation that we have been having this evening, that we want our children to see themselves in our teachers and to view our teachers as the heroes that they are, right? And so if we have a more diverse group of teachers, then we would want to aspire to be one of them. I think that, that is a pretty comprehensive question that involves recruitment and the programs that we place in our schools so that students want to be teachers, and that we're able to recruit that we're able to recruit a diverse population. It's the work of our universities, it's our recruitment process at Central, is how we're incentivizing people to want to come work with us. But it is 100% much needed. I know that our chancellor in our Department of Education has definitely been working and encouraging a more diverse group of teachers to join the Department of Education. Wanda, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add and expand upon is yes to all that you said around encouraging for more diverse backgrounds in the teaching profession, and then there is how do we engage in actions to interrupt that which doesn't allow folks to enter the teaching force, right? So the very biases that exist in the teaching preparation programs, in the state ed exams that provide teachers with licensing, and so it is indicative of a larger issue that is structural by nature and embedded in the design. And so when we look at the teaching force in New York City, it does not represent the student populations across New York City. And that's indicative of change that is very much needed in this moment in time, but that has been needed for years, right? And so how do we begin to encourage, yes, diversity in the teaching force will support young people seeing themselves as teachers and educators, And what are the systems that we are creating that speak to that and that will interrupt and provide more access and opportunity for folks to become teachers, right? For people of color to become teachers and to see themselves in that way.
Thank you. I'm bringing, what's his name? Steven?
And yeah.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so thank you everyone for doing this. It's really pretty helpful. So I am not a parent. I grew up in the district and I'm there now. But I graduated from Stuyvesant High School in 2017. So I'm just wondering what the community board, education committee, the community board in general, and the officials from the DOE that are here with us today are doing to concretely change the racial makeup of like the incredibly segregated public schools that we have in this district and across the city. More specifically for the specialized high schools, if they support repealing the Heck-Calandra Act, which mandates that Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech use the SHSAT only, and if they support including measures other than just the SHSAT in the admissions process for the 5 newer specialized high schools, which the mayor can do by himself on his own prerogative.
Okay.
I can jump in on this. So we, as a committee, we took a look at this now a year and a half ago when the mayor first had the proposal, and I think there was general support for diversifying the specialized high schools. We basically passed a sort of middle ground resolution, and I think we were waiting for. We have not taken a look at it again, and obviously nothing has changed in 2 years because the admissions in 2019 and 2020 are pretty similar to what you experienced when you were there. So I think that's absolutely something we need to take a look at again. And it's my understanding that there's nothing currently on the table, but that's something that, you know, we should continue to talk about.
Okay. I have a question from Josephine Ishman, and it says, what do I say to my kids' school that keeps saying color lives matter in addressing racism when it's Black lives specifically that are being targeted by police? A panelist can, yeah, so who would like to take that? Anyone?
Sure. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think I would want to hear more from Josephine what it means, right? Color lives matter. Like what does that mean? That would be a question that I would ask.
Okay. I think we have a question from I'm bringing up Ashley. Your question, Ashley?
Josephine's hand's raised.
Oh, she is?
Her hand was, yeah, her hand is raised. You want to?
Josephine, do you want to answer Marisol's question so we can better answer your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's so nice to see you all. This is such a safe space and a happy place. So I'm very happy to see everyone. So, you know, my school, like a lot of schools, are trying to address many of the issues that have been happening specifically in the last couple of weeks with the shootings of Black men and Black women and the protests that have happened as a result. And, you know, my school is not a diverse one. And so I can somewhat understand the use of colored lives matter, but I think that it's not really getting to the heart of what's going on. It's really Black people who are being targeted by police. So I'm trying to get the school to be, you know, more specific, pay attention to that. But I could use some suggestions on how to do that.
Hey, Josephine, it's so good to see you. And thank you for the amazing work you do as well. leading our communities and creating places and venues for communities to connect. I think you have it. I think that is the right thing. The right thing is to engage in a conversation with school administration and present your perspective. And then, you know, in a very strong way and expect action. This is the time to do that for everything that's been stated here tonight. But I would recommend that the first thing you do is that you continue to engage in the conversation with administration. And if you need support and resources, you know, we're more than happy to support you.
Thank you so much.
One of our panelists, Dr. Shirley, did you want to ask a question before I go to Ashley?
No, I lowered my hand. Thank you.
Okay. Ashley, you're next.
Hi. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for doing this tonight. It's so wonderful to hear from all of you and to hear your personal experiences and your perspective on addressing racism, especially in our schools and in our communities. I believe someone who is here tonight had a question about how to start a diversity committee or a group in your school. And so I just wanted to answer that question as someone who started a diversity group in our school. So first I would say, speak to your principal and ask them if you don't know if there's a diversity and inclusion group in your school. Some schools may have that in name only and may not be doing anything with it. So what I had to do was I had to run for the school leadership team, the SLT, because they oversee the diversity and inclusion committee. So I did that. And then in being on the SLT, I just really pushed forward. We need to do this. The time is now and it is important, and I will not stop until it's done. So, and not done, but started. I would say the first thing that for me that was really important was getting support from other teachers that were on the SLT who were very passionate about this subject, and they have been my allies, and then getting other parents on board to be allies. And during this whole process, it's very important that you be courageous and you have conversations with everybody, because we all have different perspectives. And it is uncomfortable, but I think the burden is really on us to get over that and you know, work through that, because people of color have been dealing with this for their entire lives. So the burden of changing systemic racism is not on people of color, it's really on people who are not of color. So, you know, you really have to start with yourself. You have to start reflecting and learning and figuring out your own biases. And you have to, then you can have conversations with other people. You can have conversations with your friends and your family. You know, a lot of us, those people are very hard to have those conversations about racism. And then once you know, like, where you are and the work that you need to do to become an anti-racist, you can't ever stop that education, because that education and that practice is got to continue the rest of your life. And then you also need to always continue to have these conversations with your children. Don't be afraid to talk about race with your kids. And it's everyone's responsibility, not just families of color to talk about race. They have to. It is really a matter of life and death. With white parents, they should feel that it is also equally their responsibility to talk to their kids about racism, because we do not want to raise our children to be racist. And if we do not talk about racism and how to dismantle systemic racism, then we're going to be doing a disservice to our kids, and we're going to be surprised on how they turn out, because they're not going to be the kids that we thought that we raised. So that's our own personal responsibility. So I would just say, get some allies with some parents and some teachers, and form your group. Start talking about creating a supportive, safe space where parents can talk about this, and also give resources. Share all your resources, the books, the podcasts, the articles you've read, the workshops that you're going to, you know, the documentaries you've seen. I have gotten so much love and so much support from people that I didn't even think would be interested in this. And so sometimes you might think this is only going to bring in families of color, or parents who maybe have biracial kids. But it's surprising, because white people are afraid to talk about racism because they don't want to be labeled a racist ever. But if you let them know that it's okay, we've all been born into this system where we are learning from everything that we've been receiving, these messages from the time we were born. We have to be aware that we've received these messages, and that it has given us certain assumptions, and we have to work on that every day and check ourselves so we can become anti-racist.
Thank you, Ashley. Ashley, what school are you doing this work at? You didn't share.
Oh, sorry. I'm a parent at 276. It's a PSIS 276, the Battery Park City School.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Okay, I have a question from Heather Cardinal. She says, I want to say thank you to so much, Shannon and everyone, for your presentation, an example of how this work can be done, can be effective and powerful. However, what can we do to really ensure that all schools are doing this work and that they are doing it well? What is and can the DOE do to ensure that A, this work is done, and B, this work is being done well? Because as many of you know, many of you have said, this work can resurface trauma and can be so exhausting for people of color. So how do you ensure that a well-meaning white school leader is checking in with someone to ensure they are doing and leading these discussions by reflecting, listening, hearing others?
I can definitely start and then pass it on to, Shanna's been doing this work, so she definitely has the answers at a school level. I do want to say that Wanda will be able to provide a perspective in terms of the work that is already happening across the city. I will say to you that this requires the collective doing, the collective support of everybody, right? And the reality is this work is really hard for everything that's been stated here tonight, right? We haven't talked about race ever. We are afraid of saying the wrong thing. We're afraid of hurting someone. Some of us are tired and angry and don't want to talk about it. And then we have children in the middle of it. And so it requires us to be equipped to engage in this work. That requires support. That requires resources. And so here in Manhattan, we are committed to this work. Our superintendents are committed to this work. Our Manhattan BCO is committed to continue to provide the support for teachers and staff. And then it is about it's sort of like inspect what you expect in a nice way. And so it is about visiting schools and classrooms and supporting principals. And we have principals across who are doing amazing work. And so how are we creating spaces for them to go visit one another, to come together as a group of leaders to talk about the successes and what they grapple with through a very local personal space, right? As a brown woman, as a white man, as well as a leader. And so isolating race is so critical. I am a leader, I'm the executive superintendent, and I am a brown woman. I know how I could be perceived just by the social construct. And I know how those two, right, interact. And so I need to check myself, and I need to be aware of those. And the same thing happens for principals, and the same thing happens for teachers. And so this is about self-awareness. This is about a healing process. This is about dialogue. This is about using the tools. And this is about becoming anti-racist, right? This is about courage. But I do want Wanda to maybe talk a little bit about sort of like the work that we have done for the past 2-3 years as it relates to implicit bias. And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And so our office, at the Office of Equity and Access, we have for the past 2 years been engaged in a process of doing a couple of things, right? One is that we are at this point tasked with ensuring that every single employee and staff member of the Department of Education engages in an implicit learning awareness session, right? A 5-hour session that is a foundational base for our work moving forward. In addition to that, we work with districts and school equity teams, district and school equity teams, to support their ability to, one, analyze their disproportionate data sets, specifically around special education, discipline, and access to gifted and talented and honors programming. We engage them in a 2-year process to support their ability to, one, look at a root cause analysis that identifies their beliefs. And so we go through this like unlearning process. Here are the beliefs that have given permission for these disparities to exist. We then engage the schools in a process of identifying a remedy to implement at a school-wide level, and those schools will then serve as models for a district to then expand those practices that have allowed them to interrupt and disrupt the inequities that they have discovered have been existing in their schools for a long time. That being said, it is an ongoing collective process that requires that we are constantly engaging with schools, with principals, with school equity teams in building their capacity, but also in pushing them to lean into the discomfort, right? Our silence can be considered violence, and it gives permission for the disparities to exist. Our comfort may be attributing to everything that continues to happen and that we're experiencing right now in really sad times. What I will say is that what's been really inspirational for me in the past couple of weeks and has given me hope is the ways in which students and youth and the people are really rising. And so the people united will never be defeated. And at this point in time, the people have issued a list of demands to the Department of Education, to the chancellor, across the board. And it's time for us to really like step back and listen. For me, I've also taken a stance, and when I'm engaging with principals, and I have lots of well-intended principals who have been perpetuating harm unintentionally. And so it also involves a process of one-on-one coaching and following up to have them really have a space where they can process what's coming up and how to move forward. And so it is a long, ongoing process that is really uncomfortable and necessary, right? We cannot continue to see the amount of disparities that we have experienced from, I'd say, 1619 to 2020. And at this point in time, self-care for people of color, and this is a time for our allies to really lift the work that needs to be lifted and lean into that discomfort.
And just to add on to that, like LMC started this work in 2016. We're not perfect. If that was the case, the achievement gap would have been closed in our school, and my Black and brown kids would be doing as well as their white and Asian counterparts, and that's not the case. Our Asian kids are definitely improving. We're seeing growth, but we're seeing very slow growth with our Black and brown. So as you said, like this work is continuous, and I'm so happy that like I'm part of a District 2 community where every time I attend a principal's meeting, we're talking about race. We're isolating race. We're having these discussions. There are so many workshops where, you know, I get more fueled up for this type of work. Before we went into remote learning, LMC had the pleasure of having several schools enter our building to learn about our restorative justice practices. And that was through initiatives brought on by District 2. So this work is happening, but I think for so many of us, like, we want a quick turnaround, and that's not the case. Like, racism didn't just happen yesterday. It's something that's been, you know, it's systemic. It's everywhere. And that change is not going to come as fast as we want it. But I think is that awakening and the knowledge, and I think Ashley said this before, being consistently reflective of our practices as a leader, as a parent, is what we need to do. And having these courageous conversations with people in our homes. Like, my assistant principal is white. When I was exhausted and tired and I was like, I cannot do this anymore, she said, no, Shanna, we need to do this, right? And she's the one who got all of the teachers together and they're like, let's have a meeting, right? And as a white woman, she was like, this is what I need to do. So, you know, it's ongoing, it's reflective, it's something that we're going to do, but I am happy to be part of a group that sees that there is a need for this change to occur. We're no longer blind.
Thank you. I have a question first before I go to Akila. From Io Harrington. It's difficult. She has a comment and a question. It's difficult to hear the same conversation is happening 30 years after my Black son left District 2. Parents who raised the issue of racism then were attacked and ostracized. However, it's great to see these strong, informed Black women leading the conversation. They should be leading the efforts for what's changed. Changes needs to be made throughout, I guess, District 2. By the way, whatever happened to the 2-year-old diversity committee there? Did it ever meet? Anyone want to take her question?
The diversity committee where?
I think she means the,
right?
I think she means the CEC diversity committee.
Okay.
It met once, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have not been holding meetings this year. There was a changeover in terms of leadership, unfortunately, for the CEC2 Diversity Committee, and there haven't been regular meetings. We had many years prior to this year where we met, you know, every month for years, and we did some amazing work. And because of the new change in leadership, that has not been the case this year. I was part of that committee.
Oh, Io has her hand raised. Should we bring her in so she can?
Yeah.
I'm outside, so I'm sorry if there's a lot of noise, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So then what I have to say is that during the 2 years that diversity committee was supposed to exist, you know, all kinds of atrocities have happened to Black and brown kids in that school system. We all know what they are.
We lost you, Io.
Oh.
We lost you.
Okay. All right, then I guess we'll move on.
Yeah, we'll move on. Maybe we'll get her back.
Okay.
All right, Io, raise your hand again if you get reconnected. The next person is...
I wanted to ask a question. Is it me?
Of course.
Okay.
Please.
I wanted to follow up on the question prior to Io's, because what I knowing that implicit bias is something that people are very unable to identify in themselves, and also understanding and seeing the LMC example, but there are other examples of this. I don't know how many schools are doing it, but of working with restorative justice mediators and people trained in restorative justice in creating spaces where this discussion happens in the school community. So with the staff working with border crossers, creating integrated spaces and affinity group spaces. This is not something that typically schools do. This seemed like a very unique and important step towards getting the staff to really begin to talk about and identify what implicit biases are happening in the school. So I think there's a lot of ability of schools to point outside of the school and say, this is examples of racism, this is examples of structural racism, but less so when it really comes to looking at one's own teaching practices and one's own instructional practices, because we have major blind spots when it comes to ourselves. And that example that I gave of Black teachers giving, it's not Black teachers, it's Black and white teachers are more likely to give negative feedback to Black students. So this is, understanding implicit bias, understanding how groups operate together. And if you have a group of teachers that share the same cultural history, but there's not enough diversity or representation there, I'm concerned if that is being addressed by the DOE's approach to helping and working with schools to really begin to unpack implicit bias on their home turf. I don't know.
Yes, so I guess I don't know if she's still, I can't hear you. Oh, so I wasn't sure if she looked like she was still talking, and so I didn't want to.
No, that's not me, sorry. But yeah, anyone who wants to take it, I just would love to know about that.
Yeah, so I'll say that part of our work is to engage them in the foundational implicit bias sessions, and at the end we also then engage in follow up and follow through around what are the ways and what are the actions that they will then take in their school to really go back to school, examine your curriculum, go back to school, examine who you are having lunch with, who you're sharing time and space with, and to apply strategies to mitigate implicit biases moving forward. And so it is very much an ongoing process and requires a lot of touch points throughout. And so while we have like a set of like 6 to 9 meetings throughout the year, I find myself going into certain schools much more often and engaging with them to support their ability to both identify, mitigate, and work through the biases.
And yes, 100%, thank you. I want to add that schools are in different spaces within that continuum, right? There are places where the implementation has been very technical, right? And I think someone spoke about that, we've implemented an equity team, but it hasn't translated into any meaningful disruption of inequitable practices in the classroom, the hallways, the dean's office, the guidance counselor, right? And so I think part of the work has to be with the leaders of schools, right? To really help them see those inequitable practices and calling them out, which is what Wanda is sort of like what she finds herself doing these days, right? Which is what I find myself doing with superintendents, is to call it out. So when you walk into a classroom and you see a group of Black boys in the back of a classroom, you need to call that out. You need to address that, right? When you're sitting down with a principal and a superintendent and an AP and just a group of educators to look at data, to ask to talk about the disproportionality specifically for our Black and brown boys, we want to talk about that. We want to call that out, and that is part of the work, right? I can tell you, for example, in places where we are seeing movement, is in places where we have lifted up our Black and brown young men. The high school district, for instance, has 100 young men. It's a task force. And these young men have been empowered to be true leaders, right? So in the equity teams in these schools, these young men have a seat and voice at the table. And so the recommendations that they have made to their principals and to their schools, they get to monitor with the principals and their teachers. And they are reading the same book. So they are reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. And so this is about empowering our young people, creating culturally responsive education and calling out those inequitable practices and to engage in a conversation about it. So, I so thank you for following up, Akila, because that is the reality, right? The reality is that, for some people that the courage is not there yet. The courage to do this work is not there yet. And that is our collective effort, right? That is a responsibility of mine. That is a responsibility of Wanda. That is a responsibility of Shanna to do that work. So thank you.
I think for us, there was this switch where we went from, okay, we're talking about this, we're working on ourselves, and then we want to see this being measurable. And that's why I think it's about 2 or 3 years ago, we're like, well, this needs to be part of our instructional goals. Right? Because if you're talking about how this shows up in classroom, it shows up in classroom, and then it can be measured in other ways, and therefore it needs to be infused in our instructional goals for that year, right? And that's what we began doing. Like one goal this year for us was to ensure that we were giving Black and Brown kids positions of leadership in our school. So we started a Black and Latinx club. And it was the first one. We have other clubs, and this is the first one. And it was great to see the excitement in these kids' faces that they had a space to talk. We expanded the number of people who can serve in student council because in a school where you have the majority of Asian and then second white, we know that it's middle school. It's the popularity contest at times. So not all our Black and Brown kids are represented. So by increasing the numbers, you have more students of color on the student council who are represented, who see themselves as leaders. So it was that shift in, hey, we want to talk about it. We want to look at policies. We want to look at these changes, but where else does it show up? And it was within the instruction, which really I feel like moved us and moved our teacher to closer to the front line of being very reflective practitioners.
Great.
Our next question is from Jenny. She asks, what do you do when your principal is unresponsive? Is there a way to escalate? I mean, I think she's asking, is there a way that the DOE can help if a principal refuses to actually do any of this work?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely with any escalation, right? Just like if there is an issue in a teacher's classroom, you bring it up to the principal to be addressed, right? Just when there is a problem at that level, you would bring it up to your superintendent, and then you bring it up to me, the executive superintendent. And if I'm not responsive, then you bring it up to the chancellor, right? We have systems in place to ensure that people have a voice to share their concerns when they're not being addressed.
Thank you, Marisol. I think, was that our last question?
No, there's one from a teacher.
Oh, fantastic.
From Molly.
I don't see it. Oh,
you
ask it.
Because I just want to clarify, I think many people have been having conversations around race. Many people don't have a choice. They live their lives talking about race. Example, Black people and people of color. However, many white people have not engaged, have not been talking about race, and have avoided these conversations. We white people are the ones not talking about race enough. No? Oh, just it's more a comment. I'm sorry, I thought it was a question.
I think it was more of a comment, yeah.
It was more a comment, okay. Then I think, oh,
Okay,
there's a-
thank you, Molly.
Matt Metzger, go ahead. Matt?
You're very low.
Can't hear you.
Still can't hear you, Matt.
How about now?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, hang on. Alrighty, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Great. So first, I can't begin to thank all of you guys for being here in front of this committee and this board and speaking. I feel truly lucky to be in front of all of you. So thank you very, very much. What role can white non-parents, such as myself, play in advancing educational policies and practices that foster equity. I feel like I don't have obviously I'm on this committee and here I do, but outside of this, feel like I don't have a lot of leverage. I don't have a lot of in. And so other than voting, other than donating, what can I be doing?
I can give you my email and I can give you a lot to do. For sure. Thank you so much, Matt. I think, look, there's so many things, and I want to thank you for being an ally. For me, this work, it happens everywhere, right? And I want to start with that. This work happens with your neighbors, happens right on the street, happens with your friends, especially with your friends. And so I think engaging in this dialogue right now is critical. Like, we cannot be silent. We have to speak up. We have to address this, becoming knowledgeable, learning the tools, and do that as a brown woman, to hear you say that you want to be an ally and that you want to help. I see you, Matt. Thank you. That's really important. I think, I love being here tonight. It's been actually very healing for me to be here tonight. And I want to say that. And I want to thank everybody who showed up. I think if we continue to have these conversations, I know you were talking about the diversity committee, I can't recall the name, but I think to continue to have these conversations, Matt, continue to reach out to the community across the district, continue to expand these meetings will be super helpful, for sure.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So, sorry, and I missed the first 10 seconds of, I have you on speaker over here. Part of me is has always been uncomfortable with the phrase ally because it feels a little too passive. But at the same time, I don't think there's ever been a less important time for me to speak up. I don't think there's ever been a more important time for me to speak up, but I don't think there's ever been a less important time for my voice to be heard in the world. And so I guess I'm a little silly, just kind of asking this question into the space, but how do you balance those competing interests?
I'm going to jump in real quickly, and then I'm going to turn it to Marisol, whoever wants to answer. One of the things that Marisol put in the chat, but everybody can't see, is Marisol highly recommends that we white people read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and that is actually in these presentation materials. So we'll make sure that everyone who's registered for this gets a copy of those resources. As a white person, I'm going to echo what Molly Noel said. It is our responsibility to push change forward because particularly in Community Board 2 and in District 2 and in Manhattan, we are the majority. And so for change to happen, it needs to come from the majority. I think back 101 years ago when women got the right to vote, men had to give it to them. So the same way that we need to see change in terms of anti-racism, it needs to come from the white community and people in power and to push forward that change. So I'm going to turn it over to our experts, but that's my 2 cents.
I wanted to add one thing in terms of on the community level and on the, the community level in District 2, but also larger. There are lots of groups other than Community Board 2 that really fight for dismantling systemic racism in our education system. There are lots and lots of groups to become involved with, to start allying with and working with closely. There are some amazing talks. I mean, when I was a mother of my first child, he was literally nursing. He was like 3 months old. You know, public schools hold meetings open to the community. And I went to see Diane Ravitch speak at PS3 in my local elementary school before I even had any child that was an elementary school age child. So, you know, there are so many opportunities in our community to get involved in dismantling structural racism in education without having to have children. And maybe that's something else we can put together resources. You know, there's Class Size Matters. There's a lot of different groups that are doing this work. And I would encourage everyone to get involved with that.
Thank you.
Mar, did you want to say something? I saw, Dr. Shirley, you had your hand up before. You? No, I guess not. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
This has been very interesting. I see quite a few people here that I know personally. I see Markowitz. He and I were on the CEC there. I also was chair of the, well, it was called youth then, but it basically is what evolved into education now. The time, and I've been in this neighborhood for 51 years, and I also ran schools in the district. So I've seen a lot. I came to the city when the law was with parents who had real control of the schools during decentralization in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville, and have seen a lot of things happen from then that not too much has changed actually, because what we have to remember is that the Brown versus Board of Education now has just celebrated about 50 years, and we still, New York City is the most segregated school system in the country. We are though, we have, my concern is that a lot of people call themselves liberals, and of course different, and this is not to, and I happen to know Glenn Singleton very well and know his work. And I would suggest that you read his book too, if you want to learn more about your own implicit biases. Just know we all have them. It's not just something that one race of people have. We all have them. What I think, I'm encouraged, however, by the new committee that is being formed by Community Board 2, as it relates to social justice. I understand now you're calling it diversity. Has it changed? That's something, has that changed? Your title is now diversity?
No, it's called the Equity Working Group.
Okay, great. Well, I'm encouraged. My concern is people do a lot of talking, but I don't see a whole lot of action. And one thing that has really troubled me, I am a mother of a Black son as well as 2 Black grandsons. And we have seen throughout the years a lot of injustices, especially as it relates to the domestic terrorism by the police, as it relates to Black men and even Black boys and Black children. And what has always concerned me, and I'm sort of taking the liberty of saying it now, is that what has really sort of troubled me is that I don't see any or very little white women, particularly mothers, who see constantly Black mothers losing their sons and their daughters. And, you know, I don't really see any kind of overt concern or any kind of support to that. And that's something that has really sort of troubled me too. But as you know, people talk, I tend to sort of watch what people do as opposed to what they say. And so I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing, but hopefully we will not just be doing a lot of talking. At the end of this, we're all in this together. That's a phrase that everybody uses. But you know, Janine is right. It has to come from white people. It really has to come from people who are privileged, and they are the ones that have, in fact, they're the ones who even made the whole construct. There's no such thing as race, it's a social construct. But it was designed so that people in power would make them could feel that that was a distinction between them and to maintain power against people of color. So I'll get off the soapbox. I don't generally speak up, but I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing, but I am also over the years have heard a lot of people talk and not see much action. So I'm going to be watching, and I'm also going to be hopefully not, I'd like to be proven wrong in this regard as it relates to people in Community Board 2 and in School District 2 and the Board of Education.
Thank you, Dr. Shirley.
You're welcome.
Okay. She's our last comment and question for the evening, and I want to thank our panelists again, Marisol Rosales, Wanda Vasquez, Shanna Douglas, and Akila Ascoy. We are going into business session next. You're invited to stay, but you cannot raise questions at this point, but thank you all again. We will be sending out the resource list that we had in our presentation. So thank you all again. Does anyone, or Janine, do you want to take over from here? You're muted.
Thank you again to everyone. Marisol, Wanda, Shauna, Akila, you have to stay for business session, but you all, well, and all the attendees are welcome to stay as well, but it's just our committee and CB2 members that will be discussing sort of next steps at this point. So we've got a lot of work to do. So thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody. A pleasure being here tonight. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Goodbye. I am going to share my screen, the portion of the screen.
Did I say thank you to everybody yet? Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now I come back on, right?
Yes, everybody can come back on. I'm going to share my screen to, whoops, maybe to the top, to the take action slide that we showed earlier. And I'd like to take this and add additional items to propose taking these items and as sort of the basis for a resolution, because our second agenda item was ways that we can dismantle systemic racism in our schools. And obviously talking to your children is and educating yourself, but in terms of city-wise, like what, you know, I think that every school should have some kind of anti-racist initiative, either through the principals and the teaching staff, like at LMC, which is a great example on so many fronts, or initiate a diversity committee within the SLT, like we heard about 276, that advises on social justice policies, formation of affinity groups, curriculum. In January, our committee met and we passed a resolution in support of hiring a more diverse teaching staff, obviously, and at the state level. The good news is the money didn't get cut, but we didn't get additional funding for that in this year. Let me just throw it open to the committee members about additional suggestions for where we can ask our city officials, our elected officials, and the DOE to help us take action.
Well, how do we do this, Gina? Do I raise my hand?
Yeah, you can just go ahead and speak.
Well, I just think we ought to say, cut $1 billion from the police force and add $1 billion to education.
Yeah, I will say that's a great idea. I do want to point out that the police budget is $6 billion and the school budget is about $24 billion. So the percentage, we need all the money we can get for our schools.
You know, they are talking about, they were talking about reducing the school budget. And in fact, given the sacrifices that the children and the teachers have made, they should get more money in the fall, it seems to me. I mean, if we're talking about equity, Um, you know, and if we could find more money, we would find it. But 1 billion less for police and 1 billion more for education seems
Okay.
possible.
All right. Michael, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Hi, am I on?
Yes.
Okay, two things. One is sent to Janine in the background, a link that my daughter shared with me on Facebook for Janine to consider maybe sharing with the group later. In short, it's a curriculum that everyone can work their way through in June. And there's different versions of it. There's a 10-minute a day self-education, 20 minutes, something like that, depending how deep into the subject you want to get. The other thing is just today, I learned that about, I'm not sure the exact timing, about a year ago at Brooklyn Tech, which granted isn't one of our schools, but it was very disturbing that a child of color went to the administration quietly that somebody had handed her something that I actually have a photo of. And well, what it says is N-word pass, like a hall pass or something. And I was shocked at seeing it. Further shocked at today's Facebook post that, in short, the kid got rebuffed and got no satisfaction and felt like the school had swept it under the rug. Granted, that's not one of our schools, but I intend to pursue it as best I can and find out why the school system left this child feeling like she absolutely wasn't heard. Thanks.
Well, I think that it speaks to school culture. My daughter's school, she's 9 years old, and since she was about 4 or 5, she's heard the N-word at school almost every day. So that's why, we have this take action slide up. What can we do to shift the culture in these schools to support racial equity and tolerance and, anti-racism? Because it's alive and well. Unfortunately it is.
Wow.
This is one of the reasons why I asked the question that I asked about, school leadership that, talks the talk with their supervisors and with the superintendent and with their, and with their people they have to directly report to. But it's not always the same rhetoric that school leaders give to parents and to their student bodies. There's oftentimes a disconnection between that, and you don't see any of the work that they may be meeting with their superintendent and having these discussions, but you don't see the effect of that work in the school itself. And I do think, now I'm not going to try to figure out where the money will come from, because there's so many different ways, right? Billionaires tax, the fund to police, like all different kinds of ways to do it. But there really needs to be on the ground supervision, I feel, for school leaders and for teachers, where there's another set of eyes in the school regarding this work, for the very, fact that we don't see our own bias that we carry inside of ourselves. And we don't see microaggressions that, are committed. And there's so much of this that we're blind to, and that school leaders are blind to, and that teachers are blind to, which is why children in school are racialized so often and so regularly and so consistently. That there really needs to be, I feel that we need to have something in our resolution that calls for on the ground supervision in every teaching institute that we have. Someone who it's their job or part of their job, I mean, maybe they could have other jobs too, but to name what's happening, to bring it to awareness, bring it to the surface, and present it to the leadership and the staff for reckoning and dealing, and really doing that deep dive and doing that work.
I'm just going to throw out some ideas. This could be part of the comprehensive educational plan. It could be part of the quality review. I'm just trying to think within existing DOE structures. I guess wish we had some teachers still on here. I think we do in the attendee section. But those are two things that jumped out to me. Because I mean, obviously the accountability, but those are things that are reviewed from the top down. Barbara, do you have any thoughts on that? Barbara,
my head is spinning with a lot of thoughts. I think that's a great idea. I was thinking, I was principal of a middle school on Staten Island. And as this whole thing was going on tonight, I remember the year we opened up in 1976 and the trouble we had because the education department wouldn't allow the school to open unless we bused children in. Now on Staten Island, you didn't have a lot of busing. People went to the neighborhood schools. The school that I previously taught at, there was a project and the children would come to that school. But when this new school was built, it couldn't open unless we bused those children in. So the neighborhood, the parents were up in arms. They didn't want their kids to have to go out of their community. But the main part of my story is that the white community that moved to Staten Island at that time to live in that neighborhood, to go to a white school, they were up in arms when we were busing children in. Our first few years, there were rocks and stones thrown at all the buses. The community was terrible. I mean, Staten Island, you know what Staten Island represents. It's not a very liberal community at all for all ethnicities. I moved there when I was 4. I was Jewish. I can't tell you the names that I was called and my mother and family when we lived there. But I remember, I'm telling you the story. If I'm taking too long, Janine, stop me. I was in charge of the 7th grade and we had an SP class. And a parent, this woman was up in arms because she could not believe that her daughter was really in an SP honors class. She demanded a meeting with the principal and with me. And we sat there and she said, it's not an SP, it's not an honors class. And I was naive and of course it is absolutely. And why not? Because there was a Black Afro-American student in the class. So this is 1976. When I retired in 98, the same kinds of feelings were there. They were just under the surface a little bit. I share that because that story resonated for me forever. It took a long time for the school to establish a tradition. The kids were always fine. It was the parents. So as you're talking tonight with everything about the school and everything, you have to start working with the parents. You have to start educating the parents. When the kids are in school, they're hugging, they're holding hands. They don't see color. They don't see it until they start to go home and then hear it at home. I mean, as it gets into the high school, it's a little different, but lower grades, middle school, the kids were always fine. It was when the parents started to talk and carry on. But getting back to what you're saying, maybe an ombudsman, someone that's in the school that serves, that's there to watch the staff, to be a mediator for the staff, someone who's trained, that the district, the central board has someone trained in every single school to be the ombudsman, for someone to go to, for a teacher to go to give workshops for teachers, to be there for the kids. I mean, I could go on forever about this. Another program that I think is very valuable is called Facing History and Facing Ourselves. It's a program out of Boston, and it deals with the Holocaust. But their philosophy was that it's taught as an interdisciplinary thing. You don't just teach the Holocaust in history or social studies. You teach it throughout all the subjects, which might be a way to teach about Black history and all kinds of history through every subject area, not just to isolate it. So Janine, I could go on for hours, but I just had to get some of this stuff out.
Thank you, Barbara. And I do think it needs to be through all subjects, and really it's the DOE, the state and the DOE have definitions for culturally responsive sustaining education. And the question is, how do you actually roll that out to the schools? Coral, I see that your hand is raised. You have a question or comment? Coral?
Sorry. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I've always been a big believer in trying to get people to be incentivized to do the right thing, because people will find a way around if it's all about the letter of the rule versus the spirit of the rule. So my suggestion would be, rather than sort of investing more in sort of like policing, even if internally or self-policing, would be more to change the incentive structure so that you cannot advance within, both as a student, a family, or a faculty member, without actively doing something every single year that promotes racial tolerance and diversity. And it can't just be like a check the box, I went to a diversity night. It has to be something that you have constructively done that makes a big difference. Like, we can have curriculum developed around even CB2's Black history that is, you know, really diverse and about all, and celebrates all the different areas. There's plenty of work to be done. We need lots of people to do it. So, you know, basically, if you want to be a part of the PTA, if you want to be in any sort of leadership position whatsoever, you have to do it to qualify. I think you have to compel everyone, because if you don't compel everyone, those that already are on board are going to show up, and those that don't want to listen or feel like they're being somehow negatively treated will never show up. So I think it has to be something where you have to do it for your child, because you're holding your child back if you don't, as a parent or as a family, do something. And then also as teachers, you aren't going to advance unless you're doing that well. So I would really look at the overall incentive structure and make sure it's aligned with what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Coral. Great suggestion. Does anyone else have any comments?
I also, Janine, I also think that there has to be greater diversity on the staff in a lot of these schools, because many of these schools don't have any teachers to look up to. They only see one color in many cases. And I think that should be a prime thing with DOE, more diversified staff.
Yeah, we just passed a resolution last year, right?
Yeah, in January.
Yeah.
Yeah, to diversify the workforce and funding for training.
So we can reiterate
Absolutely.
that. Betty, you had a comment, question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with what Coral said, but I also think that it is important that there are sort of standards for how schools respond when incidents happen at the schools that are sort of standard across the board. Obviously, there are different school communities that require different responses, whether this is something that happens frequently, whether there's racism in the school, or whether it's less frequent depending on what school you go to. But I do think that oftentimes I've experienced, or just I know people that have experienced sort of a lack of satisfaction, a dissatisfaction with the response to incidents of racism inside of school communities, and that there isn't a sort of restorative justice based approach, and that the victims or people that have sort of heard about it and weren't the active, you know, recipients of the racism, but sort of feel like their community is one that is sort of simmering with hate or has this sort of like hateful undertone that they don't want to be a part of. Those people are often left feeling unsatisfied with the response and feeling like no one has their interests at heart. They just sort of, a slap on the wrist was given to the person that said the N-word, or the person that, you know, put something on the wall, whatever it may have been, that was racist or, you know, otherwise discriminatory. And I think that perhaps instituting more specific things that can be done in response that will make school communities feel as though things have actually been addressed and will be changed moving forward is something I think that's worth investing in, or at least thinking about.
I think that's great, Betty. Yeah, I mean, I think that we've gotten used to that disappointment, and actually are at the point where we don't expect anything ever to be addressed. I mean, speaking for myself anyway, and my experience in the New York City public school system. But yeah, maybe we can do something around that. Maybe in our resolution, you know, create a system of reporting, documenting, and, you know, a clear protocol for addressing specifically these kinds of incidents.
I mean, you know, positive reinforcement or incentivizing strategies, I think it's always good to do both, right? To have a system where you are incentivizing this, you know, this type of behavior that we want to see occur more, where we're dismantling systemic racism. But the issue is, one of the issues is that white privilege is really incentivizing, like very incentivizing when you are in the privileged part of the society, of the community. And, you know, I think that having a, you know, having, and not so much policing, but really like a mediator. Like, I don't know if anyone has ever been to or restorative justice workshops or like border crossers, but I know some of the people on the committee have, and myself as well. And it's really about illuminating what is happening and what is you are engaging in. And so that's what I'm thinking, more than a policing of staff, but really someone there to highlight and shine a light on naming racism when it's there, and you know, for example, I think another thing that we can do is like, or we can advocate for, is we do have a strong issue in our schools of Black boys being more likely to be referred for special education, more likely to receive special education services, more likely to be diagnosed with behavioral problems. I mean, I had an experience where my, you know, son of color was told to me by the teachers that he has a behavioral problem. When I did get him evaluated on, you know, outside of school, he ended up having a learning disability. And it's a very different approach. So maybe we can also advocate for there to be more attention given to these systems that are in place in school regarding demerits or suspensions or special education referrals, you know, things that impact the children of color in the school directly, and have more of a process where you have to talk about, is there a racial or racializing of this child that is happening right now, in, you know, in advance of giving out those kinds of recommendations to parents, or you know, consequences for kids. I don't know if that's something we can.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw in something that sort of piggybacks on that. Is I just think in, you know, all institutions, and schools are institutions, you know, the first reaction is to sweep the bad news under the rug. And I think, you know, and schools are, you know, like, oh, you know, I don't want to report that some kid used the N-word. Nobody's going to want to come to my school. And I think that when people address and deal with these issues, I think somehow we need to figure out how to celebrate that in a way, because it's illuminating a problem and that they're addressing it versus ignoring it. I think of this, you know, I think everyone here is probably getting the New York City texts about domestic violence reporting is down substantially. People know it's still happening, it's just not being reported. So I think there has to be almost like, if nothing's being reported, I think we need to question if any real work is being done. Because I think, you know, particularly at the elementary and middle school level, you know, kids are kids, and they're going to say things or do things. Sometimes they're going to use words because they know they have power without knowing what those words mean if they're very young. Or, you know, they're going to bully, and they're going to use some, you know, from a racial way to do that in middle school or older levels. So I think we need to not, you know, every time there's something, it's some incident, you know, you see it in the New York Times, such and such school had this problem, but these problems are happening all over the place. They're just not being reported or bubbling up to the press level. And I think there needs to be a willingness to address these issues and not hide from them. Matt, you had a comment or question?
I had a question. The association I had to one of the topics in terms of teaching, having teachers or some type of staff, the mediator or whatever, is when we discuss dyslexia, and that I know I want to advocate that for schools to have teachers that are trained in Orton Gillingham. I've learned that. Is there an accreditation process, or are there is there something to be advocating for? We want X type of teachers who have this type of training, or we want a social worker who has this type of training, or is there some type of mechanism there? Well, nationally recognized, I don't know, or just around.
There is not, but it's interesting because I got a text today saying that the Boy Scouts must now receive a diversity patch. And I joked, like, this should be for the highest office in the land should have to get a diversity patch before they can run. But certainly our teachers should receive this training and make a commitment to this type of work before we put them in schools. Sure. Right? I mean, I agree.
Absolutely.
100%.
There are many restorative justice groups that work in organizations. So they may not work in schools, but like the Atlantic Theater Company works ongoing with their staff with restorative justice mediators to look at how systemic racism is impacting their company and how their company is running. I mean, these are things that schools could also adopt. I mean, there are groups that do this work, all the time in different organizational structures.
All schools have this respect for all, and you've seen the posters wherever you are in a school. Perhaps having that group have more training around restorative justice, because I'm not sure where we're going to find the funds to let this happen going forward.
Well, we already have, the DOE in District 2 anyway said that they are working with 2 organizations that we are very familiar with that are supposed to be going into schools and doing this work. At my daughter's school, one of those organizations was supposed to start work at the beginning of the year. They never stepped foot in the building. So, I mean, I think that everybody knows this work has to be done. We had Marisol on, we had Wanda on. They don't go to work every day doing nothing. They're actually doing this work, but we have to figure out why it's not coming into the school buildings.
Right.
We have a whole Office of Equity and Access. We have tons of DOE diversity staff. Where is the disconnect and where is the oversight? How do we address that?
Are we willing to name it? Because my guess is we know what it is. I don't know. Do we know what it is, and are we willing to name it?
What do you think it is?
Yeah.
What would you name it, Matt?
At the local level? I mean, I think CEC could be doing a whole lot more.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe restorative justice team should be in every school.
Right.
Yeah.
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 A chief diversity officer was actually one of the recommendations of the SDAG.
That's what I was talking about, having someone in a building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I think somebody in every building is a fantastic idea.
But I think training for staff, they always have, the DOE always every year would have a particular topic, whatever the thrust was that particular year, and have training for staff that get accredited or a certificate of approval, whatever. And I think training for staff would be very important.
The thing about the training is, somebody asked me this the other day. Actually, a parent at my daughter's school said, you know, I'm willing to pay for it, but and I'll bring them in, and they can do trainings for parents, and we'll offer something for the kids, and we'll offer something for the staff. And I said, you know, the problem with this is the people that show up for these optional trainings are always the families of color, those who have been victims of discrimination. And the people who perpetrate the discrimination and the racism don't show up because they don't think they have a problem.
But Mara, it would be mandated for every staff member. They have professional development days. There are days in the beginning of the year before school opens. They can do training during those times.
They are doing them. They do them, and they have them. And there is now evidence that, you know, this kind of training, these one-off trainings, even if they're 2 or 3 times a year, they're not as effective as ongoing training. So this really has to be incorporated into the everyday.
So to me, like, one of the most salient pieces of the work that LMC, that, you know, Shauna presented from LMC, and, you know, you want to skip over it and just go straight to documenting, but what you skip over is that process of a year or 2 years of the staff having affinity groups themselves, having, talking about their own trauma and racial experiences that they've had as people in this world. And that is really the beginning of this work. You can't start identifying it really in your school until you start from that personal place, which is why I think having somebody on the ground in the school to lead those because those kinds of discussions are also really, they make you very vulnerable. They're very emotional. They can be re-traumatizing to people of color if it's not done well as well, which you don't want to do, right? So that's the kind of work that needs to be done in order to get to the place where you can then operationalize anything in the school.
Okay.
So how do we do that? What do we, what should we resolve? I think we all agree with that everybody in the school, especially the teachers, need much better understanding about their implicit bias.
Right.
So
I think it needs to be ongoing. I mean, that's what I'm hearing over and over again. And in a perfect world, there would be a chief diversity officer at every school. But I think it also needs to be, we need to figure out we recommend that it's woven into structures that already exist, because, that's probably the most effective way to make something happen in a diminishing budget environment as well. But I don't think, we should mention both. We should mention, the wish list and then the practical. And I would propose that I've been taking pretty detailed notes on everyone's comments. Combine this, can have a draft to everyone by tomorrow morning.
Oh, great, Janine.
That's good.
After I get some dinner.
But you're absolutely right. Ongoing, somebody in each school,
right,
works with the teachers, helps with implicit bias. I think
part of PD training, like part of the regular PD schedule, which could ensure that it's ongoing.
Yes, for everybody. And I think diversity and restorative justice. I think with that rubric, you get the idea that you really see what's going on. And Akila's point about, behavior problems might be learning problems. I mean, you really get a different way of looking at what's going on, which people need.
It's going to require the staff to really take a look into themselves and to trust each other to share their experiences. That's going to take, there are a lot of walls there. It's a hard thing to penetrate.
Yes.
That's going to be a tough one.
Yeah.
Can we put something in there about maybe asking schools to make a diversity statement or a pledge?
I like the mission statement.
Yeah, like in their mission statement, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of schools have them, not a lot of District 2 schools.
Well, I think you're right. That is I mean, I have to say everything that LMC has done and is doing is really, I mean, a gold standard, at least as far as I can tell. I'm sure there's someone somewhere that's doing it better, but I don't know. They were pretty, Shanna was amazing.
Yeah, in all new schools that are being created, they insist that you have to have this language in your mission statement. That you really must be talking about restorative justice and inclusion practices in your mission statement.
Good.
So I think that we should ask all schools to do it. It shouldn't just be the new ones.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Do we have any other comments? If people think of things after this ends, send send an email to our committee. I know this group is not shy.
Right.
If you guys are done with that, I had something else I just wanted to run by everybody.
Okay.
Janine, the free internet is ending next week for all the students. And I'm going to advocate tomorrow that all the Manhattan community boards send a letter to the providers. I guess some of them have been more willing to consider extending that, and a couple of them have not. I don't have the correspondence directly in front of me, but I'm assuming that's something that you all agree with.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I just wanted to run it by you guys since it's specifically a DOE issue, and an email just came to us today. I wasn't aware of that, but it's obviously made a huge impact. Having the availability of that and continuing that, it's obviously very important.
Wow. I mean, what are all these kids who are going to be in their apartments all summer going to do?
Exactly, and that's why it's kind of hard to believe, those companies would not just do it. Given, I mean, it's difficult to understand sometimes why these are not easy decisions for these corporations, and why everybody needs to advocate for something that seems so obvious to all of us here in the city.
Yeah.
And as we go forward through the summer, Janine and I were just talking about this briefly. There's a lot of stuff for you guys is figuring out things before the next school year of all these decisions that might be being made, and just things that we can highlight. So, encourage everybody to share with me. There's some things that are very consistent with what we have on record, but sometimes sending a letter or following up on things, can remind either our elected officials or, others about specific things that are important to us as a community.
And the rubber meets the road on the budget, which is the end of this month for the city council, because, the remote learning and the pandemic have shined a, spotlight on the poverty in our school system that disproportionately impacts students of color, and the digital divide, the ability to get social workers. All of these things impact education, and those with the fewest resources are hurt the most. So we may work something like that into this as well. That was in our resolution last month, but you can't underestimate that at this point. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it shocks me that anybody would think of reducing the education budget.
Right.
No.
I'm really seriously. If we're going to reduce any budget, it better be the police.
Absolutely.
Seriously.
Okay. Well, at this point, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. This was a long meeting, and
Thank
we
you.
covered a lot of great ground. Special thanks to Akila for really doing a lot of research, and your presentation was amazing. And to Mar and Patricia, who basically said we need to do this. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Be well. Be safe.
I had a quick question. Are we talking about the remote learning survey at some point in our meetings, or was that on this? Was that on?
Oh, by the way, Brad Hoyleman has his own version of the kind of reopening remote learning survey. Is that the one you're talking about, the current one?
I haven't seen Brad's. Well, we didn't officially have it on our agenda, but I guess it falls. We had, because it came out. I'm not sure what date. Come out Friday. I did do I did download a PDF of that and shared that with the committee. There were 3 parts. There was sort of the health issues, sort of like, as a parent, is it, if we clean the building every day, do you need that? Will you be very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, not comfortable? Will your child wear a mask? I mean, all those health issues, to me, those are going to be driven by health experts and not the DOE. But whatever happens, it's going to cost a lot of money. So that gets back to the budget. The second area, you were discussing that. We discussed it the other day, Akila. I mean, you had some pretty, in terms of the types of, the new term, I was on a call yesterday, is blended learning. It's no longer called remote learning. This is a scenario what we've been calling hybrid, where some of the kids stay home and some of the kids go to school. And that is going to be, and the questions in the survey seem to be rationing education. Like if you can only pick these 3 subjects, what would you pick? Akila, I don't know if you want to elaborate on
maybe
that.
we can send the survey to all the committee members and they can take it and see what it was like.
Yeah, I sent it to everyone. I think you should have a PDF.
Oh, great. Everyone should look at it, because it really was like they're trying to parse up education, what all of the students have been getting up until now, not even in some areas, not even adequate levels, but saying, choose your top 3 most important things that you think should happen next year in school. And one of them's like, strong content areas and academics. Another choice is arts education and physical education. Another choice is, helping students struggling with reading and writing. And it goes on. And you can only choose 3 when all 8 of them, or 6 of them, or whatever they are extremely important. So it makes me very worried it just makes me very worried about what the DOE's approach is to school next year.
Well, also, where does what we talked about tonight get incorporated now? Do they have to take another look at it? I mean, where does all this stuff go?
They haven't even really put this. I mean, they mentioned something about social emotional learning was another one of those options in that question. Social emotional, was another option that you could either, say you think is important or not. But they didn't really talk about this at all in the survey.
Well, right, because this is it's happening now, but I mean, it would be amazing.
I'm going to share the question here's the question that Akila was talking about. If schools are not open every day, what are the most important experiences for your child to attend in person? Instruction and core content, support for students who are struggling, all the specials, art, music, PE, and electives, activities that build social emotional, provisions of in-person related services like counseling or speech, OT, PT, or behavioral support. So you only get to pick 3.
You can only pick 3.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
It looks like what are we going to pay for, right? I mean, that's what I read in that question.
That's ridiculous. I mean, if a family chose,
I read that as a COVID question.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you have it. That is because I mean, I know what's not happened for my child. I mean, you get like We get these lovely lists of art projects and music projects that you're welcome to do on your own.
Right.
So if you're musically inclined or artistically inclined, you're going to do art. But if you're not, that's the whole point of having these classes at school, is to expose you to things that you otherwise wouldn't do on your own.
Right.
And,
You can also incorporate, though, like math with music and art with math. I mean, there's ways they can blend it together. So if they have to cut down on hours and time, there's absolutely no reason you have to pick either or. You can certainly instruct or do both. Do an art project. I mean, it's just that's not very creative thinking. And if they really are limited on teachers, they could also have like a hub for every grade that then provides on a remote learning at a great level, and people can choose to do that, or they can choose to go to their local school. You know,
and do more interdisciplinary work.
Yes, and then you could so that
a couple of subjects together.
So that can be a family choice, whether or not you're deciding to go because it's more important to you to go in person or have the social emotional, interaction of classmates, or you need to have some, actually well-developed curriculum that then is leveraged across the entire, maybe even across the entire city per grade level. So, I mean, there's ways of doing it that don't require replicating it in every single school 3 times or 3 different ways.
Yes, I agree. There's so much cross-pollination. The thinking there is really narrow and really limited. And there's so many creative ways to cover all of those bases. So I'm very concerned. And also, how likely are you to, the CDC issued directives to opening schools for the country. It's not, friendly suggestions. It's directives. It's clear what will keep everyone safe to restart in-person instruction. So, to ask parents to rate how likely they would to follow those directives, to me, is framing it as a political issue instead of as it's led by scientists and we're going to do what's safe for the public.
It can be just because there are offerings being developed, because I have to, for my daughter's school, which is a private school, I have to turn in my election by tomorrow of what type of, whether I want to send her in person, if they're going to do it in person, whether I want to do it remotely or this sort of hybrid. And my election is due tomorrow. So I'm electing to send her in person, knowing that they will do it remote if it's not safe. So it could just be that question.
Yeah, but some of the questions what do you wear a mask?
Well, we're going to have to wear masks. They've already told us you have to wear a mask the whole time.
Right.
They've already told us you will wear masks the entire time. And they will be
on the survey. It's how likely would you be to send your kid to school if they had to wear a mask?
They have to wear a mask. We're going to wear masks for another year.
I'm good to go. Yeah.
Thank you. Reality check.
Yeah.
So.
Figuring out the numbers of who they're going to have to accommodate outside of the school.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. We got a lot of work cut out.
Talking about.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up, Kayla. Okay. At this point, I'm going to say good night.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you.
Great meeting. Bye-bye.
Really great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
Good night.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.